The spring breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across Shadow Creek Valley as 5 rough men rode toward the solitary farmhouse nestled against the pine-covered hills. Their expressions were as cold as the steel they carried, their intentions as merciless as the winter that had just passed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They couldn't have known that the elderly woman tending her garden, her hands gnarled from apparent arthritis, her silver hair dancing in the breeze, was once known as Nightshade Nora Blackwell, the most brilliant and elusive outlaw leader the Arizona Territory had ever seen. With more successful bank heists than any criminal in the last 3 decades, she had vanished without a trace when President Grant still occupied the White House. Their mistake would be their last. Eleanor West stood among her early spring plantings, carefully working the soil with practiced hands. To any observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a woman in her 70s, determined to maintain her independence despite advancing age. Her faded blue dress and simple grey shawl gave her the appearance of any frontier widow, the lines on her face suggesting a hard life honestly lived. From her garden she had a clear view of the entire valley, a fact that was no accident. Shadow Creek farmhouse had been designed with sightlines in mind, though none would recognize this deliberate feature. Eleanor had chosen this remote valley 26 years ago precisely for its singular approach road and the protective ring of hills that allowed her to spot visitors long before they arrived. The farmhouse itself appeared modest but sturdy, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and multiple windows. Anyone familiar with frontier architecture might notice unusual features: the extra thick walls, the slightly elevated foundation, the peculiarly solid shutters. But few visitors ever came to Shadow Creek, and those who did saw only what Eleanor wanted them to see, a simple widow's home, unremarkable in every way. "Sarah," Eleanor called toward the house, her voice carrying the slight quaver of age. "Would you bring me some water, dear? The sun's getting warmer." Inside the house, 23-year-old Sarah Taylor looked up from the book she'd been reading. Unlike Eleanor, she was not what she appeared to be. Though she called herself Sarah Taylor and played the part of a distant niece who had come to help her aging aunt, neither her name nor their supposed relationship was true. Sarah moved to the window, peering through the lace curtains toward the garden. She'd been living with Eleanor for nearly 3 years now, ever since she'd fled from her husband in the night, blood on her hands and terror in her heart. Eleanor had taken her in without question, offering sanctuary when Sarah had nowhere else to turn. Over time, she had learned pieces of Eleanor's true history, fragments shared during long winter evenings or in rare moments of candor. She knew enough to understand that Eleanor West had not always been a simple farmer, that her past contained secrets darker and deeper than Sarah had initially imagined. She grabbed the water pitcher and headed outside, her eyes automatically scanning the horizon, a habit Eleanor had instilled in her from the beginning. "Beautiful day," Sarah remarked, handing Eleanor the water. Her tone was casual, but her words held meaning. It was their code for all clear. Eleanor nodded her thanks, taking a long drink before returning to her work. "Indeed, though I believe we might have visitors before sunset." Sarah's posture stiffened slightly. "Oh, are we expecting someone?" "No," Eleanor replied, her tone still conversational, though her eyes had narrowed almost imperceptibly. "But the birds have been unsettled all morning, and Mr. Johnson mentioned strangers in town when he delivered our supplies yesterday." Sarah understood the warning. In the 3 years she had lived at Shadow Creek, they had developed their own language, seemingly innocent observations that carried deeper meanings. Birds being unsettled meant Eleanor had spotted something concerning. Mr. Johnson's gossip was Eleanor's way of corroborating her suspicions with external information. "Should I prepare for company then?" Sarah asked, her hand unconsciously moving. To touch the pocket of her apron where a small derringer was concealed, another habit Eleanor had encouraged. Perhaps, but finish your reading first. No sense in disturbing a peaceful day prematurely. As Sarah returned to the house, Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the distant road that wound through the valley. Her eyes, still sharp despite her 72 years, had caught the telltale dust cloud nearly 15 minutes earlier, riders approaching, moving at a measured pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Eleanor straightened slowly, pressing one hand against her lower back as if pained by the movement, a gesture she had perfected over years of playing the role of an aging widow. Anyone watching would see only an elderly woman finishing her gardening before the day grew too warm. They would not notice how she positioned herself to retrieve the walking stick leaning against the nearby fence post, nor how that innocent-looking support concealed a custom-modified Winchester rifle with a shortened barrel. Inside the house, Sarah moved with efficiency born of practice. She closed her book and placed it carefully on the side table, then checked the loading on the Colt revolver hidden in the drawer. Eleanor had taught her to shoot with that weapon, spending hours on target practice in the small canyon behind the property. "A woman alone needs to protect herself," she had said, "especially a woman with a past." Sarah had never asked directly about that past. It wasn't her way, and Eleanor clearly preferred selective disclosure on her own terms. But, over time, she had assembled the fragments. Eleanor had come from Boston originally. She had been married once, briefly. She had traveled extensively throughout the Western Territories during the tumultuous years following the Civil War, and something had happened in Willow Springs in '73. Something that had changed everything. The rest was speculation, based on skills Eleanor had revealed during their time together, her uncanny ability to read people, her extensive knowledge of banking practices, her precision with firearms that seemed at odds with her supposed upbringing, and the peculiar modifications to the farmhouse that became apparent once you knew what to look for. Hidden compartments, reinforced doors, secondary exits from every room. From the window of the upstairs bedroom, Sarah could now see what had caught Eleanor's attention: 5 riders approaching from the east, still distant but moving steadily toward the farmhouse. Even from this distance, something about them raised her concern. They rode too deliberately, their formation suggesting experience rather than casual companionship. Sarah checked the loading on the rifle kept in the corner cabinet, then moved to the small drawer of the bedside table where Eleanor had shown her how to stash ammunition within easy reach. 3 years ago, such preparations would have seemed paranoid. Now, they felt like common sense. Down in the garden, Eleanor gathered her tools unhurriedly, placing them in the basket as if concluding her morning's work. Nothing in her movements betrayed awareness or concern, yet every action brought her closer to the walking stick with its deadly secret. The riders drew nearer, close enough now that their features became distinguishable. Leading them was a tall man with a weathered face and a scar that ran from temple to jaw, his dark coat and flat-brimmed hat giving him the appearance of authority, self-appointed if not official. Flanking him were 2 men who shared enough similarities in their features to suggest brothers, both armed with rifle and revolver. Behind rode a younger man with sandy hair, perhaps not yet 30, whose nervous glances suggested less experience than his companions. The 5th rider, broader than the others with arms like tree trunks, brought up the rear, a shotgun resting casually across his saddle. Eleanor recognized their type immediately. During her years as Nightshade Nora, she had encountered every variety of frontier predator, from corrupt lawmen to professional bounty hunters to opportunistic thieves. These men belonged to the latter category, organized enough to be dangerous, disciplined enough to have survived, but lacking the official backing that might constrain their actions. As they approached the gate to her property, Eleanor finally lifted her head as if noticing them. For the first time, she squinted in apparent confusion, shading her eyes with one hand while the other casually retrieved the walking stick. "Afternoon, ma'am," called the leader, reining his horse to a stop at the gate. His voice carried the practiced charm of a man accustomed to manipulating others. "Hope we're not disturbing you." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the slight quaver she had perfected over years of playing her role. "Don't get many visitors out this way. Something I can help you gentlemen with?" "Benjamin Hawkins, ma'am," the man introduced, himself with the tip of his hat. "My associates and I have been riding since dawn. Might we trouble you for some water for our horses? Been a dry journey from Copper Ridge." Eleanor nodded, the picture of frontier hospitality, despite the wariness she felt. "Of course, pumps round back by the barn. Help yourselves." "Much obliged," Hawkins replied, swinging down from his saddle with fluid grace that suggested physical capability despite his apparent age. He handed the reins to the younger man. "Riley, see the horses." As the one called Riley led the mounts toward the barn, Hawkins approached the garden fence, his assessment of the property too thorough to be casual. "Fine place you've got here, ma'am. You manage all this yourself?" "My niece helps," Eleanor answered, gesturing vaguely toward the house. "Sarah came to stay with me a few years back. These old bones aren't what they used to be." "I imagine not," Hawkins agreed, his gaze lingering on the farmhouse windows. "Been here long?" Eleanor noted the deliberate nature of his questions, recognizing the familiar pattern of someone gathering information before making their move. "Long enough, 20-some years now. My late husband Thomas bought this land after the war. God rest his soul. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. The brothers had dismounted now, one moving toward the house, while the other circled toward the barn. Their positioning was too deliberate to be coincidental. They were establishing control of the property, cutting off potential escape routes. "You live quite remote out here," Hawkins observed, his tone still conversational, though his eyes had hardened. "Nearest neighbor must be miles away." "We manage," Eleanor replied simply. "Sarah should have coffee on. Would you care for a cup before you continue your journey?" The invitation was calculated. Bringing them inside would limit their movement options and place them in an environment Eleanor knew intimately, with all its hidden advantages. Hawkins smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's mighty hospitable. Of you, Mrs. West, Eleanor West, Mrs. West." He tested the name as if weighing its authenticity. "Coffee sounds just fine. Been a long ride." As Eleanor led the way toward the house, leaning heavily on her walking stick in a performance of age and frailty, she assessed their situation with the tactical clarity that had once made her the most successful bank robber in 3 territories. 5 men, all armed. Riley, the youngest, appeared less hardened than his companions, potentially the weak link. The brothers had separated, indicating experience with coordinated action. The large man remained mounted, maintaining a position that overlooked the entire property. Hawkins himself presented the greatest immediate threat, his questions too pointed, his assessment too thorough. He was looking for something specific. Inside the house, Sarah had observed the arrival and subsequent positioning of the visitors. She recognized the tactical nature of their approach from Eleanor's teachings about threat assessment. These were not lost travelers seeking directions or traders looking to barter. They had come with purpose, and that purpose likely involved the remote farmhouse and its seemingly vulnerable occupants. She moved to the kitchen, starting coffee as Eleanor had suggested, while keeping the loaded Colt within easy reach beneath her apron. Through the window, she watched Eleanor leading the man toward the house, noting how the older woman had positioned herself to keep the walking stick on her dominant side. 3 years ago, Sarah might have been paralyzed by fear in such a situation. But Eleanor had methodically replaced her terror with preparation, her panic with practiced responses. Fear keeps you alive, Eleanor had told her during those early days, but only if you make it serve you rather than control you. As Eleanor reached the porch steps, with Hawkins following closely behind, Sarah positioned herself by the door, ready to greet them with the demure manner expected of a young frontier woman, while maintaining awareness of every movement around. The property, the game had begun, 5 predators circling what they believed to be easy prey, unaware they had walked into a carefully constructed trap. For the moment, Eleanor would continue her performance as a simple widow, her apparent frailty, her greatest deception. But beneath that facade, Nightshade Nora was calculating odds, assessing weaknesses, and preparing for the inevitable moment when pretense would give way to revelation. The Shadow Creek farmhouse had been designed for precisely this possibility, unwelcome visitors who might threaten the peaceful existence Eleanor had built. Every room contained hidden advantages, every piece of furniture positioned for both convenience and potential cover. What appeared to be a simple homestead was, in reality, a fortress disguised as a humble home. As she ushered Hawkins through the front door, Eleanor caught Sarah's eye briefly. The young woman's slight nod confirmed she understood the situation. The coded warnings had been received, preparations were in place. Whatever these men wanted, they would find Shadow Creek far more dangerous than its peaceful appearance suggested. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Eleanor gestured toward the solid oak table that dominated the main room. "Sarah, dear, our guest would appreciate some coffee." Hawkins settled into the offered chair, his eyes continuing their assessment of the interior, noting exits, windows, potential valuables. "Cozy place," he remarked. "Don't often see such fine furnishings this far from civilization." "My husband had particular tastes," Eleanor replied, easing herself into the rocking chair positioned to give her clear sightlines to both the front door and the windows. "He brought a few pieces with us when we came west. The rest he built himself. Thomas was quite skilled with woodworking." The sound of boots on the porch announced the arrival of one of the brothers, a lean man with a weathered face and calculating eyes. "Barn's secure, Ben," he reported, his gaze flickering briefly to Eleanor before surveying the room. "Riley's seeing to the horses." "Thank you, Frank," Hawkins acknowledged. "Mrs. West has kindly offered us coffee." The man called Frank nodded, positioning himself near the door, another tactical choice that did not escape Eleanor's notice. Outside, the second brother and the large man maintained their positions, effectively surrounding the property. Sarah placed cups of coffee on the table, her movements deliberately unhurried. "Sugar," she offered, maintaining the appearance of hospitality while using the opportunity to study their visitors more closely. "Much obliged," Hawkins replied, adding sugar to his cup. He took a slow sip, then set the cup down deliberately. "Mrs. West, I'll be direct with you. My associates and I aren't simply passing through. We've come looking for something specific." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, though her hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the walking stick. "Is that so? And what might that be, Mr. Hawkins?" Hawkins leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Information about a certain bank robbery in Tucson back in '72, a substantial amount of gold that was never recovered." He paused, watching her reaction. "Gold that some say found its way to this very valley." The accusation hung in the air, precise and targeted. This was no random encounter, no opportunistic robbery. These men had come to Shadow Creek with specific purpose, drawn by rumors or information that connected the remote farmhouse to a decades-old heist. Eleanor's face betrayed nothing as she sipped her coffee. the picture of confused innocence. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Mr. Hawkins. Thomas and I didn't arrive in this valley until 75. Whatever happened in Tucson before, that has nothing to do with us." "That's so." Hawkins reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully, revealing a yellowed wanted poster. The illustration showed a woman with sharp features and confident eyes, her hair drawn back severely. Beneath the image was printed, "Wanted, Nightshade. Nora Blackwell for bank robbery, train heist, and evasion of justice. $5,000 reward." Eleanor didn't need to look closely at the poster to know its contents. She had seen dozens like it during her years as Nightshade Nora. This particular one had been circulated after the Tucson National Bank job, her last and most spectacular heist, before disappearing into the anonymity of Eleanor West. "I don't understand," she said, her voice conveying genuine-seeming confusion. "What does this old wanted poster have to do with me?" Hawkins studied her face intently. "Funny thing about Nightshade Nora. She vanished completely after Tucson. Some say she died in a shootout near the Mexican border. Others claim she took her share of the gold and established a new identity somewhere remote." His eyes narrowed. Somewhere like Shadow Creek Valley, Sarah, who had positioned herself near the kitchen doorway, felt her chest tighten. In the 3 years she had lived with Eleanor, she had pieced together fragments of the older woman's history, enough to recognize that Hawkins' accusations held more truth than Eleanor would admit. But she had never imagined something of this magnitude, never suspected that the calm, methodical woman who had taken her in might once have been a notorious outlaw. Eleanor's laugh held genuine amusement, a perfect performance of an elderly woman confronted with an absurd notion. "Mr. Hawkins, I may be many things, but I assure you I am not some infamous bank robber. I'm simply a widow who's lived a quiet life in this valley for many years." "Perhaps," Hawkins conceded, though his expression remained unconvinced. "Then, you wouldn't mind if we have a look around? If there's nothing to find, we'll be on our way with no further disturbance." The request, delivered as if reasonable, carried clear threat. These men had not come to leave empty-handed. "I'm afraid I would mind," Eleanor replied, her tone hardening slightly. "This is my home, Mr. Hawkins, not a public house. You've had your coffee and water for your horses. I think it's time you continued on your journey." Frank shifted his position by the door, his hand dropping casually toward his holstered revolver. "Ben doesn't like being refused," he said, his tone conversational but threaded with menace, "especially when he's ridden so far on good information." Hawkins sighed, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "Mrs. West, if that is indeed your name, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. My associates have secured your property. The nearest neighbor, as you pointed out yourself, is miles away." He leaned forward, dropping all pretense of civility. "The Tucson gold is here. Our source was quite specific about that." Eleanor's eyes flickered briefly to Sarah, a silent communication passing between them. 3 years of living together had created an understanding that transcended words, signals and responses, practiced during long evenings when Eleanor had insisted on preparing for possibilities. "And who might this source be?" Eleanor asked, buying time as she assessed their deteriorating situation. "A gentleman recently released from Yuma prison," Hawkins replied. "Joseph Blackwell. Name sound familiar?" The name struck Eleanor like a physical blow, though her expression revealed nothing. Joseph Blackwell, her brother-in-law, her late husband Richard's younger brother, a man who had ridden with the Nightshade gang for 3 years before being captured in a botched stage robbery. A man who knew enough of her operations to make connections others could not. "Can't say that it does," she lied smoothly, even as her mind raced through implications. Joseph had been sentenced to 20 years. If he was out now, he must have earned early release, or more likely, bought information with cooperation. He Describe this valley in detail, Hawkins continued, watching her closely, right down to the widow, who settled here not long after Nightshade Nora disappeared. Quite a coincidence, don't you think? Outside, a gunshot shattered the tense standoff. A single report from the direction of the barn, followed quickly by a second. Frank's head snapped toward the sound, his hand drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. In that moment of distraction, Eleanor moved with a speed that belied her apparent age and infirmity. The walking stick in her hand twisted, activating the concealed mechanism that released the Winchester rifle hidden within. By the time Hawkins registered the transformation occurring before him, he found himself staring down the barrel of Eleanor's weapon. All pretense of frailty vanished as Nightshade Nora emerged from decades of careful concealment. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice now strong and clear, all traces of quaver gone, "I believe we need to reassess our situation." Benjamin Hawkins froze, his hand halfway to his gun as he stared down the barrel of Eleanor's Winchester. The transformation before him seemed impossible. The frail widow had vanished, replaced by a woman whose steady hands and penetrating gaze spoke of experiences far removed from simple frontier living. "I wouldn't," Eleanor advised calmly, as Frank's finger tensed on his trigger. "I rarely miss at this range." Outside, the sounds of struggle continued briefly before falling silent. Sarah had edged toward the window, maintaining her own revolver. "Trained on the men. What happened to Riley?" Hawkins asked, his voice tight. "Your young man made a poor decision in the barn," Eleanor replied without elaboration. "Now, Mr. Hawkins, we find ourselves at a crossroads. You've come seeking Nightshade Nora based on information from Joseph Blackwell. You've found instead a woman who doesn't appreciate armed men threatening her home." The front door opened slowly. Sarah tensed, but Eleanor remained steady as a large man with graying red hair and a blacksmith's build entered, shotgun in hand. He nodded briefly to Eleanor. "The situation outside is secure," he reported. Two men, both disarmed. The young one took a spill when the trapdoor gave way, but nothing broke. Hawkins' eyes widened slightly at this new development. "Trapdoor? Mr. Sullivan has been maintaining my property for years," Eleanor explained, referring to the newcomer. "He includes certain security features in his work." Sullivan positioned himself near the door, his shotgun covering both Hawkins and Frank. His presence changed the balance of power dramatically, eliminating any advantage the intruders might have imagined they possessed. "You've gone to considerable trouble based on the word of a convicted thief," Eleanor continued, addressing Hawkins directly. "Perhaps now you'll explain exactly what Joseph told you, and why you believed it warranted threatening an elderly widow." Hawkins seemed to reassess his options, recognizing the precariousness of his position. "Joseph Blackwell served 15 years of a 20-year sentence," he said finally. "Got out early for cooperation with territorial authorities regarding certain unsolved cases. And in exchange for this cooperation, he implicated me in a decades-old bank robbery." Eleanor's tone conveyed skepticism rather than alarm. "Not directly," Hawkins admitted. "He spoke of a woman who led the most successful gang in Arizona Territory. During the early 70s, said she disappeared after the Tucson heist with over $75,000 in gold." His eyes narrowed. "Said her favorite flower was nightshade, same as grows wild behind your barn." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, though Sullivan shifted his weight slightly at this specific detail. "Joseph always was observant," Eleanor said after a moment, neither confirming nor denying anything. "What else did he tell you?" "That Nightshade Nora had a distinctive scar on her right forearm, result of a stage robbery gone wrong near Whisper." Rockin' 69, Eleanor's free hand moved unconsciously toward her right arm before she caught herself. The gesture was brief but revealing, and he described a valley with a creek running through it, nestled in hills shaped like a horseshoe, where he believed she'd established a new life after Tucson. Hawkins glanced around the room. A valley exactly like Shadow Creek. The detailed information explained their confident arrival, their certainty about what they would find. Joseph Blackwell had provided them with enough specific details to connect Eleanor West with Nightshade Nora Blackwell, connections no casual observer could have made without insider knowledge. "I see," Eleanor said simply. Her mind raced through implications and possibilities. Joseph had been captured before the Tucson heist, so his knowledge of the gold was second-hand at best. But he knew enough about her to make dangerous connections. "What I don't understand," she continued, "is why you thought a direct confrontation was your best approach. If you truly believed I was Nightshade Nora, you must also have believed I was dangerous." Hawkins smiled thinly. An elderly widow and her niece living alone in a remote valley. The odds seemed favorable. The sound of boots on the porch interrupted their conversation. Sullivan shifted position slightly, maintaining his aim on the captives while covering the entrance. The door opened to reveal a young man with a bloodied forehead. Riley, the youngest of Hawkins' gang, now disarmed and visibly shaken. "Found this one trying to get back to his horse," came a female voice behind him. A moment later, a woman in her late 40s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical braid, stepped into view, pushing Riley forward with the barrel of a rifle. "The others are secured in the barn," Eleanor nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Martha. Perfect timing as always." Sarah shot Eleanor a questioning glance. The arrival of Martha, evidently another ally Eleanor had positioned without mentioning, suggested a level of preparation beyond what Sarah had realized existed. "Mrs. Sullivan came by to drop off eggs," Eleanor explained to Sarah, though her eyes remained fixed on Hawkins. "She noted our visitors and took appropriate precautions." Martha Sullivan, the blacksmith's wife apparently, guided Riley to a chair with firm efficiency. "Sit," she ordered, maintaining her rifle at ready, "and keep your hands where I can see them." The complexity of Eleanor's security arrangements was becoming clear. What had appeared to be an isolated homestead was, in fact, a carefully constructed operation with multiple layers of protection and Confederates positioned nearby. "Now," Eleanor continued, addressing Hawkins once more, "we return to the matter at hand. You came seeking Nightshade Nora and the Tucson gold. Instead, you found a situation considerably more complex than you anticipated." As she spoke, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window caught her features in profile, momentarily illuminating a resemblance to the wanted poster Hawkins had produced earlier, a resemblance normally disguised by her deliberately stooped posture and the different hairstyle she had adopted as Eleanor West. "You are her," Hawkins said, certainty replacing his earlier speculation. "Nightshade Nora." Eleanor neither confirmed nor denied the accusation. Instead, she glanced at Sullivan, communicating something unspoken. The blacksmith nodded almost imperceptibly before addressing Frank and Riley. "On your feet," he directed. "We're going to join your friends in the barn while the ladies have a private conversation with your boss." Frank bristled. "I'm not going anywhere without Ben." "You misunderstand," Sullivan replied, his tone conveying dangerous certainty. "This isn't a negotiation." Martha shifted position, her rifle now covering Frank directly. "My husband doesn't repeat himself," she advised, "and I don't miss this range either." The combined authority of the Sullivans proved persuasive. After a brief hesitation, Frank and Riley allowed themselves to be escorted from the house, leaving Eleanor alone with Sarah, Martha, and Benjamin Hawkins. Once they had departed, Eleanor gestured toward the oak cabinet against the far wall. "Sarah, would you bring me the box from the second drawer, please?" Sarah moved to comply, retrieving a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. She placed it on the table between Eleanor and Hawkins, then resumed her position near the window. 26 years ago, Eleanor began, her voice taking on a reflective quality, A woman named Nora Blackwell disappeared after orchestrating the most successful bank robbery in Arizona Territory history. Some said she died in a shootout near the Mexican border. Others claimed she'd escaped with the gold to South America. She traced the inlaid pattern on the box with one finger, her expression distant. The truth, Mr. Hawkins, is rarely as dramatic as the stories men tell. And what is the truth? Hawkins asked, his eyes fixed on the box. Eleanor considered him thoughtfully before responding. The truth begins much earlier, in Boston, 1865. The war had just ended, and a young woman named Eleanor Prescott found herself destitute after her father's shipping business collapsed, victim of embezzlement by his business partner and closest, her friend. As she spoke, her posture straightened further, years seeming to fall away as she allowed herself to revisit a past long buried beneath her carefully constructed identity. With no prospects and no family remaining, this young woman traveled west, seeking opportunity in the expanding territories. What she found instead was lawlessness masquerading as justice, banks that stole from depositors through fraudulent practices, railroad companies that seized land from rightful owners, corrupt officials who enforced laws selectively based on bribes and favors. Hawkins shifted in his chair, impatient with what seemed like digression. And this young Boston woman somehow became Nightshade Nora? Eleanor's smile held no warmth, not immediately. First she became Mrs. Richard Blackwell, wife to a territorial surveyor who shared her sense of outrage at the corruption they witnessed. She paused, her expression softening briefly at some private memory. Richard had a particular talent for maps, detailed renderings of terrain, property boundaries, and most significantly, the locations and security features of territorial banks. "Your husband was part of your gang?" Sarah asked, unable to contain her surprise. This was information Eleanor had never shared during their 3 years together. "Richard was its founder," Eleanor corrected. "The Nightshade operations began as his concept, selective redistribution from corrupt institutions to the farmers and ranchers they had swindled. He recruited his younger brother Joseph, then 2 former Union soldiers with specialized skills." She opened the box, revealing a man's gold pocket watch nestled on velvet. "This was Richard's, the only possession I kept when I became Eleanor West." Hawkins watched her with calculated interest. "What happened to him?" "The Prescott National Bank job in '68. Something went wrong. We never determined exactly what. Richard was shot by a guard as we escaped." Her voice remained steady, though her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the watch. "He died 2 days later in a cabin near Granite Creek." The personal revelation hung in the room, transforming what had been an abstract historical figure, the notorious Nightshade Nora, into something more complex. A widow whose criminal career had been born of loss and idealism rather than simple greed. "After Richard's death, I took control of the operation," Eleanor continued after a moment. "Joseph wanted to abandon the cause, but I refused. The original purpose remained valid, exposing corruption while providing restitution to its victims. We became more selective in our targets, more precise in our methods, and more successful," Hawkins observed. Eleanor nodded in acknowledgement. "Richard's planning had been thorough but sometimes impractical. I introduced certain refinements, timing coordinated to banking schedules, disguises tailored to specific contexts, escape routes developed with multiple contingencies." As she spoke, Sarah realized she was witnessing the gradual emergence of Nora Blackwell from behind Eleanor West's careful facade, not in dramatic revelation, but in subtle shifts of posture, tone, and expression. The woman she had known for 3 years remained, but now integrated with a history far more extraordinary than Sarah had imagined. "The Tucson operation was to be our last," Eleanor continued. We had accumulated sufficient funds to establish new identities, invest in legitimate enterprises. The territorial marshals were employing more sophisticated methods. It was time to conclude while we maintained the advantage. But something went wrong, Hawkins suggested, filling the pause in her narrative. Eleanor's expression hardened. Someone betrayed us. We had planned extensively, timed the approach to coincide with a shift change in security, identified alternative routes out of the city, and established rendezvous points across 3 counties. Yet marshals were waiting at 2 of our escape. Routes, Joseph? Hawkins questioned. No, Joseph was already in Yuma by then. This came from within our active membership. Her tone suggested this betrayal still ranked after all these years. 3 of my people died in the resulting pursuit. 2 others were captured and later hanged. Martha, who had remained silent during Eleanor's recounting, spoke up. Nora was wounded, shot through the shoulder during the initial escape. By all rights, she should have been captured with the others. This revelation from Martha suggested the woman knew far more about Eleanor's past than her role as a neighboring farmer's wife would indicate. In fact, her familiarity with these historical details implied a more direct connection to the events. Being described, Eleanor glanced at Martha with a hint of warning before continuing. I managed to reach our final contingency point, a cabin in the Dragoon Mountains, where emergency supplies had been cached. There, I made the decision that Nightshade Nora would cease to exist. And Eleanor West was born, Hawkins concluded. Not immediately. First came Ruth Anderson, a widow traveling to California, then Mary Cooper, a shopkeeper in New Mexico territory. Eleanor West emerged only after I found Shadow Creek Valley and determined it suitable for long-term settlement. The methodical progression through multiple identities revealed the careful planning that had allowed her to evade capture for so many years, each transition putting further distance between her notorious past and her peaceful present. And the gold? Hawkins asked, returning to his primary interest. Eleanor closed the watchbox with deliberate care. The Tucson gold served multiple purposes, Mr. Hawkins. It established this farm and several legitimate businesses throughout the territory. It provided new beginnings for those gang members who survived and wished to reform. A significant portion was anonymously returned to depositors who had lost their savings when Western Exchange Bank collapsed the previous year. You expect me to believe Nightshade Nora turned philanthropist? I expect nothing from you, Mr. Hawkins. I'm simply providing context for the situation you've created through your ill-considered actions today. Hawkins leaned forward, his expression calculating. Joseph Blackwell believes you still have most of the gold hidden somewhere on this property. He described a specific location, a root cellar beneath the barn floor, concealed by a false wall. At this, Martha tensed visibly, her finger shifting closer to her rifle's trigger. Eleanor's expression remained impassive. Joseph was never privy to financial distributions after Richard's death. His information, like much of his character, is unreliable. Then you won't object to us searching this root cellar? There is no root cellar, Mr. Hawkins. The space beneath. The barn houses a natural spring that provides water during drought seasons. Joseph might have confused this property with another. The lie, if it was a lie, was delivered with perfect conviction. Hawkins studied Eleanor's face, searching for any tell that might reveal deception. Regardless, Eleanor continued, your immediate concern should be your current predicament rather than decades-old gold. You've come armed into my home, threatened me and my household, and demonstrated clear intent to commit robbery at minimum. These actions have consequences in any civilized society. Are you suggesting you'll turn us over to the territorial marshal? Hawkins asked, unable to completely mask his skepticism. Rather risky, given your own legal situation. My legal situation? As you put it, involves crimes committed more than 25 years ago by a woman officially declared dead in 1874 after the border incident I mentioned. Eleanor West's documentation is impeccable. Property deeds, tax records, business transactions, all established through legitimate channels. She smiled thinly. The territorial marshal attended my barn raising in '77. This deft maneuvering, establishing Eleanor West as a legally distinct entity from Nightshade Nora, represented the culmination of years of careful planning. While Hawkins might personally believe they were the same woman, proving it legally would present considerable challenges, especially after so many years. "Then what do you propose?" Hawkins asked, recognizing his disadvantage, but clearly unwilling to concede entirely. Eleanor glanced at Martha, some unspoken communication passing between them. "That depends on several factors, Mr. Hawkins. First, the condition of your men and the nature of their intentions. Second, your willingness to reconsider your plans regarding Shadow Creek and its residents. Third, your ability to recognize when a situation has developed beyond your capacity to control it." Before Hawkins could respond, Sullivan returned from the barn, his expression grim. "The others are secured," he reported, "but we may have a problem. The big one, Wallace, had this in his saddlebag." He placed a folded paper on the table. Eleanor opened it to reveal a hand-drawn map of Shadow Creek Valley, with the farmhouse prominently marked. Annotations in the margin detailed various approach routes, guard schedules, and most concerningly, a specific date. "Tomorrow." "What is this?" she demanded, turning to Hawkins. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Hawkins' face. "Insurance," he admitted reluctantly, "in case our initial approach proved unsuccessful." "Explain," Eleanor ordered, her voice taking on the tone of command that had once directed the most successful outlaw gang in the territory. "We are not alone in pursuing Joseph Blackwell's information," Hawkins said after a moment's hesitation. "A man named Reeves, former Pinkerton agent turned bounty hunter, has assembled a larger team. They're camped 2 days' ride from here, waiting for our signal, or for your failure to return," Sullivan concluded grimly, "which would indicate resistance and bring them directly to our doorstep." Eleanor absorbed this new information with the calculated assessment that had once made her legendary. Their situation had just become considerably more complex. Hawkins and his men represented not merely an immediate threat, but the advance party for a potentially larger operation. "How many in Reeves's group?" she asked, her mind already formulating. "Contingencies, 8, possibly 10 by now. Professional men, most with military or law enforcement background." The implication was clear. Even with Sullivan and Martha's assistance, defending against such a force would prove challenging. Unlike Hawkins's opportunistic crew, these would be disciplined men with experience in coordinated action. "You've created quite a predicament, Mr. Hawkins," Eleanor observed, though her tone suggested calculation rather than alarm. "For yourself most immediately, but for all of us by extension." Sarah, who had remained silent during much of the historical revelation, stepped forward. "What do we do?" she asked, her question directed to Eleanor, but her gaze fixed on Hawkins. Eleanor considered the question carefully, weighing options against potential outcomes with the strategic clarity that had once made Nightshade Nora the most elusive quarry in territorial history. First, she decided, we secure our immediate position. "Martha, please check the perimeter and ensure no additional members of Mr. Hawkins' party are lurking undetected." She turned to Sullivan. "Robert, I believe it's time to implement our contingency preparations." The blacksmith nodded, understanding. "I'll need about 2 hours." "You have one," Eleanor replied. "Sarah, please gather essentials according to the list we discussed last winter. Prioritize the items in the root cellar and beneath the kitchen floorboards." These rapid-fire instructions, delivered with calm authority, revealed extensive preparation for precisely this kind of emergency. Plans, developed long before and apparently shared with trusted Confederates. "And me?" Hawkins asked, a note of resigned irony in his voice. Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. "You, Mr. Hawkins, have a choice to make. One that will determine not only your immediate fate, but potentially your long-term prospects as well." The others moved to execute her instructions. Eleanor West, once the notorious Nightshade Nora, leaned forward, her expression conveying the dangerous competence that had made her legend decades earlier. "Now, let's discuss exactly what you're going to tell Mr. Reeves when you communicate with him tomorrow." As dusk settled over Shadow Creek Valley, the farmhouse had transformed from a peaceful homestead into a hive of disciplined activity. Sarah moved methodically through the rooms, gathering essential supplies and securing them in canvas packs designed for quick transport. The items Eleanor had instructed her to prioritize revealed yet another layer of preparation previously hidden from view. Gold coins sealed in waterproof pouches, documents wrapped in oilcloth, a small leather case containing surgical tools, and medicines. Outside, Robert Sullivan had converted the barn into a staging area. The trapdoor that had captured Riley earlier now stood open, revealing not just the pit below, but a secondary tunnel entrance that had been concealed behind a false wall. 2 horses were already saddled and waiting near this hidden egress, while Sullivan methodically checked and loaded a collection of weapons that would have impressed any territorial armory. Martha Sullivan had taken charge of the prisoners, relocating Hawkins' men from the barn to a stone storage cellar, accessible only through a heavy oak door. With practiced efficiency, she had secured them in a way that ensured their temporary confinement without risking permanent injury, a balance that suggested experience with such matters. Inside the house, Eleanor and Hawkins remained at the oak table, their conversation having evolved from confrontation to negotiation. A map of the surrounding territory lay between them, weighted at the corners with small brass figurines. "Reeves will approach from the east," Hawkins explained, tracing a route along Cottonwood Creek. "He prefers dawn operations, better visibility for his men, disorienting for anyone just waking." Eleanor studied the indicated path with the tactical assessment of someone accustomed to planning both attacks and defenses. "The ridge here provides too much cover," she observed, tapping a location approximately 2 miles from the farmhouse. "He'll position at least 2 men with rifles as overwatch before the main force approaches." Hawkins nodded, confirming her analysis. "Reeves is methodical. He'll establish containment before closing the net." "How do you normally communicate with him?" Eleanor asked, shifting focus to the immediate logistics. "Lantern signals from the North Ridge, 2 short, 1 long after sunset, indicates all clear for the approach. 3 short means resistance encountered. Approach with caution, and if there's no signal at all," Hawkins' expression darkened. "Then he assumes the worst and comes in force, prepared for hostile action." This information crystallized Eleanor's options, none of them ideal. Attempting to use Hawkins to misdirect Reeves carried significant risk. One misstep in the deception would alert the former Pinkerton to potential trouble. Eliminating the signal entirely would trigger immediate, aggressive response. Their approach left little margin for error. "Mr. Hawkins," Eleanor said after a thoughtful pause, "I'm going to make you an unusual proposition." "I'm listening," he replied cautiously. "You came to Shadow Creek seeking Nightshade Nora and the Tucson gold. What if I offered you a portion of that gold in exchange for genuine cooperation in redirecting Mr. Reeves and his team?" Hawkins' eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're admitting that gold exists?" "I'm proposing a business arrangement based on mutual interest," Eleanor corrected. "One that potentially benefits all parties while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed." Before Hawkins could respond, Sarah entered from the kitchen, her expression conveying urgency without alarm, the controlled response Eleanor had trained her to maintain during the crisis. "Everything's prepared according to the list," she reported. "Robert says the tunnel is clear to the ridgeline, and Martha has secured the storage cellar." Eleanor nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Sarah. Would you ask Robert to join us? I believe we've reached the negotiation phase." As Sarah departed to fetch Sullivan, Hawkins studied Eleanor with renewed calculation. "You've prepared extensively for this possibility," he observed. "Not just the gold and the tunnels, but the coordination, the ready allies. This isn't an improvised response. It's a contingency plan, years in the making." 26 years, Eleanor confirmed matter-of-factly. "From the moment I selected Shadow Creek Valley, I understood that my past might eventually intrude upon my present. Each preparation you've witnessed today represents a specific countermeasure for a specific threat scenario." "Including former Pinkerton's leading bounty hunters?" Eleanor's smile held grim amusement. "Mr. Hawkins, I evaded the actual Pinkerton Detective Agency for 7 years during the height of their influence. Their retired agents merit appropriate respect, but they're not infallible." Sullivan entered, wiping his hands on a cloth that didn't quite conceal the gun oil staining his fingers. His expression remained professionally neutral as he assessed the scene before him. "Robert," Eleanor greeted him, "Mr. Hawkins and I are discussing potential cooperation regarding our mutual situation with Mr. Reeves and his associates." Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're trusting him now?" "Trust is earned through demonstrated reliability," Eleanor replied. "What I'm proposing is a transaction with clear terms and verification measures." She turned back to Hawkins. 20% of the remaining Tucson gold in exchange for your assistance in directing Reeves away from Shadow Creek permanently." Hawkins didn't bother concealing his interest, though his expression suggested he was calculating relative values. "What exactly would this assistance entail?" "A controlled meeting with Reeves at a location of my choosing. You explain that you found a widow living alone, but no evidence connecting her to Nightshade Nora or the Tucson robbery. You direct him toward a false lead I'll provide, one convincing enough to merit investigation, but ultimately inconclusive. And my men, released unharmed once Reeves has departed the territory, with appropriate compensation for their inconvenience." Sullivan shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the proposed arrangement. "Eleanor, is this wise?" "Wisdom often requires balanced risk assessment, Robert," she replied, without taking her eyes off Hawkins. "Mr. Hawkins came seeking profit, not martyrdom. I'm offering him a path to the former while avoiding the latter." The negotiation represented Eleanor's pragmatic approach to problem-solving, identifying leverage points and aligning incentives, rather than resorting to threats or violence when alternatives existed. It was the same strategic thinking that had made Nightshade Nora's operation so successful during their 7-year run. Hawkins considered the proposition, weighing variables, with the calculation of a man accustomed to risk assessment. 30%, he countered, "and I want assurance the gold exists before meeting Reeves." 25%, Eleanor responded smoothly, "with half provided prior to the meeting as demonstration of good faith. The remainder transferred after verification that Reeves has departed territorial boundaries." The counteroffer reflected both compromise and caution, providing sufficient incentive while maintaining leverage through the final payment. Eleanor had conducted similar negotiations throughout her extraordinary career, whether arranging passage through contested territories or establishing terms with informants inside banking institutions. "How much are we discussing?" Hawkins asked. "Directly. Approximately $15,000 at current valuation," Eleanor replied. "Your share would amount to roughly $4,000, significantly more than Joseph Blackwell suggested might be recovered, with considerably less risk than your original approach entailed. The figure was substantial, more than most working men would see in a decade of honest labor. The implied total value of the remaining gold, while significant, was far less than the mythical sum that had fueled decades of speculation about the Tucson heist. After a moment's calculation, Hawkins extended his hand. "We have an agreement, Mrs. West. Or should I call you Mrs. Blackwell?" "Eleanor will suffice," she replied, accepting the handshake with the formality of a business transaction. "Robert will escort you to verify the initial payment while I prepare the documentation for your meeting with Reeves." As Sullivan led Hawkins toward the back of the house, Sarah re-entered from the kitchen, her expression betraying concern she couldn't fully conceal. "You're really giving him gold?" she asked once the men were out of earshot. Eleanor began gathering the maps from the table, her movements efficient despite her advanced age. "I'm giving him an appropriate incentive to behave according to our mutual interest," she clarified. "The specific nature of that incentive is tailored to his particular motivations." "But can you trust him? Once he has the gold—" "I trust consistent self-interest, Sarah. Mr. Hawkins values his continued well-being more than he values heroic failure. The arrangement I've offered maximizes his profit while minimizing his risk, a combination most men find persuasive." Sarah's skepticism remained evident as she helped gather the maps. "And if he betrays you anyway?" Eleanor's expression hardened momentarily, revealing the steel beneath her carefully cultivated persona. "Then he'll discover why Nightshade Nora maintained her freedom for 7 years, despite the best efforts of 3 territorial marshals and the entire Pinkerton Detective Agency." The statement wasn't delivered as threat or boast, but as simple fact, a reference to capabilities Eleanor had demonstrated throughout her extraordinary career. The woman who had orchestrated the most successful bank robberies in territorial history had not survived by misplacing trust or failing to prepare. "For betrayal, what can I do?" Sarah asked, accepting Eleanor's assessment without further challenge. "Help Martha prepare provisions for transport. We'll proceed with evacuation preparations, regardless of Hawkins' cooperation. If his meeting with Reeves proves successful, we'll have invested effort unnecessarily. If not, that effort may prove the difference between escape and capture." This dual-track approach, pursuing negotiation while simultaneously preparing for its failure, exemplified Eleanor's strategic thinking. Throughout her career as Nightshade Nora, she had never relied exclusively on a single plan or approach, instead developing multiple contingencies for every operation. As Sarah departed to assist Martha, Eleanor moved to the small writing desk positioned near the window. From a hidden compartment beneath the drawer, she extracted a leather portfolio containing documents accumulated over decades. Property deeds, bank drafts, letters of introduction from prominent citizens, all establishing the legitimacy of Eleanor West's identity and standing. Among these papers lay a smaller envelope addressed simply Sheriff Thomas Bradford, Copper Ridge. Eleanor opened this envelope carefully, examining the letter within before returning it to the portfolio. The contents apparently satisfied her as she selected a fresh sheet of paper and began composing what appeared to be an updated version of that correspondence. Her penmanship, elegant and precise, belied her apparent age as she crafted the document with careful consideration for each phrase and implication. This was no hastily contrived deception, but a measured communication designed to withstand scrutiny from even the most suspicious recipient. Outside, the sun had fully set, darkness settling over Shadow Creek Valley like a protective blanket. Martha lit lanterns inside the house, their warm glow creating the appearance of an ordinary evening routine while concealing the extraordinary preparations underway. In the barn, Sullivan guided Hawkins down a narrow staircase revealed by the trapdoor. The passage, carved from the hard-packed earth and reinforced with timber supports, extended beneath the structure before opening into a small chamber with a solid oak door. "Your insurance policy?" Hawkins asked, gesturing to the tunnel. "One of several," Sullivan acknowledged as he produced a key from his pocket. "Eleanor believes in preparation." The lock opened with a solid click, revealing a surprisingly spacious room beyond. A proper root cellar lined with shelves containing preserved foods, medicines, and other essentials for extended self-sufficiency. Along one wall stood a row of sturdy wooden crates, each secured with iron bands and hefty padlocks. Sullivan approached one of these crates and produced a second key. 25% is agreed," he said, unlocking the container. "You'll want to verify the contents." Inside the crate, nestled in straw for protection, lay rows of neatly stacked gold coins, double eagles minted before the war, their $20 face value now exceeded by their gold content alone. Hawkins lifted one, testing its weight and examining the mint marks with the practiced assessment of someone familiar with precious metals. "Genuine," he confirmed, returning the coin to its place. "Though I admit curiosity about how much remains beyond my share." Sullivan closed the crate without responding to the implied question. "Eleanor is preparing documentation establishing legitimate transfer of these assets. You'll need to account for sudden prosperity when you return to civilization." "She thinks of everything," Hawkins observed, his tone suggesting both admiration and wariness. "It's why she survived when others didn't," Sullivan replied matter-of-factly. "Now, let's discuss your meeting with Reeves. The timing and location need to be precisely managed if this arrangement is to succeed." Back in the house, Eleanor had completed her letter and was now examining a detailed map of the region surrounding Shadow Creek. Her finger traced various routes, assessing distances and terrain features with the expertise of someone intimately familiar with the territory's geography. Martha entered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Provisions are packed," she reported. 2 weeks' worth, distributed as you specified. "The medicines are secure in the oilskin pouches." And Sarah, "Checking the livestock arrangements. The Henderson boy will come tomorrow for the chickens and milk cow as planned. They'll be well cared for until this is resolved." Eleanor nodded. "Approval. What of our guests in the cellar?" "Secure and relatively comfortable," Martha replied with professional detachment. "I've provided water and basic provisions. Young Riley's head wound is minor, more frightened than hurt." "Good. We need them healthy but contained until arrangements with Reeves are confirmed." Eleanor folded the map carefully before continuing. "I appreciate your assistance, Martha, both today and throughout these years." The simple acknowledgement carried significant weight between them, recognition of a partnership that apparently extended far beyond neighboring farmers, helping each other through frontier challenges. "The Blackwell gang was family," Martha responded, quietly. "Some bonds don't break just because the riding ends." This exchange revealed another layer of connection previously unmentioned. Martha Sullivan had evidently been part of Nightshade Nora's original operation, rather than merely a neighboring ally. The revelation explained her familiarity with historical details and her comfortable competence with firearms and prisoner management. "Some things stay with us," Eleanor agreed, her gaze momentarily distant. "Though sometimes I wonder if Sarah suspects more than she admits about our shared history." "The girl's observant," Martha acknowledged, "and you've trained her well, whether you intended to or not." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Different circumstances than we faced, but similar principles. The world remains dangerous for women without protection or preparation." The observation highlighted an unexpected continuity between Eleanor's past and present. Her focus on preparedness, her attention to security, her emphasis on self-reliance had served Nightshade Nora well during her outlaw years, and continued to shape her approach to life as Eleanor West. The specific applications had changed, but the underlying principles remained consistent. Their conversation paused as Sullivan and Hawkins returned from the root cellar. Hawkins's expression suggested satisfaction with the verification process, though his alert posture maintained the wariness of a man accustomed to shifting circumstances. "Mr. Hawkins has confirmed the initial payment," Sullivan reported. "We've discussed logistical arrangements for the Reeves meeting." Eleanor nodded in acknowledgement. "Excellent. I've prepared documentation for your review, Mr. Hawkins. The background information you'll provide to Reeves regarding your investigation here." She gestured to the papers on the writing desk. "The core narrative remains essentially truthful. You found an elderly widow and her niece living quietly in Shadow Creek, with no evidence connecting them to Nightshade Nora or the Tucson gold. Your investigation revealed that Joseph Blackwell's information was based on rumor rather than first-hand knowledge." Hawkins reviewed the documents with careful attention to detail. "And the alternative lead you mentioned?" "Page 3, Eleanor directed. "Financial records suggesting significant deposits in a Prescott bank shortly after the Tucson robbery. The account holder, Thomas Fleming, disappeared after withdrawing the funds in late '73. His description matches several witness accounts of a man seen near the bank on the day of the heist. The fabricated evidence was convincing in its specificity, dates, amounts and locations that could be independently verified, though their interpretation would ultimately lead investigators down an unproductive path. It represented the same careful attention to detail that had characterized Nightshade Nora's most successful operations." "Fleming is fictional, I assume?" Hawkins asked, impressed despite himself. "The name is," Eleanor confirmed. "The bank records are authentic, though their connection to Tucson is manufactured. The deposits came from legitimate mining investments I established through intermediaries years ago. This level of preparation, creating verifiable financial trails designed specifically as potential misdirection, demonstrated foresight that bordered on prescience. Eleanor had apparently anticipated the possibility of renewed investigation. Decades before Joseph Blackwell's release from prison had triggered actual pursuit. "What about the lantern signal to Reeves?" Sullivan asked, returning to practical logistics. "Mr. Hawkins will provide the all-clear signal tonight as scheduled," Eleanor decided. "We arrange the meeting for tomorrow at Cottonwood Crossing. Far enough from Shadow Creek to protect our location, but close enough to appear reasonable for initial contact." "And if he insists on seeing the farmhouse himself?" Hawkins questioned. "You explained that I suspected your intentions and threatened to notify the territorial marshal if you returned. Given your own legal complications, this created sufficient deterrent to justify redirecting focus toward the more promising Prescott lead." The explanation was perfectly calibrated to Hawkins' established character and motivations, a reasonable decision to pursue easier profit rather than risk confrontation with authorities. Reeves, with his law enforcement background, would recognize such pragmatic calculation as consistent with men of Hawkins' profession. "Once Reeves accepts the redirect, you'll accompany him to Prescott to maintain the deception," Eleanor continued. "Martha has associates there who will provide additional verification for the Fleming narrative, enough to convince Reeves the lead merits serious investigation." "You've established quite a network," Hawkins observed, his tone suggesting newfound respect for the extent of Eleanor's preparations. "Survival requires multiple layers of security, Mr. Hawkins, a lesson Nightshade Nora learned early and Eleanor West never forgot." The statement, delivered with calm certainty, encapsulated decades of experience navigating dangerous circumstances. From her earliest days as an outlaw leader to her current management of this unexpected threat, Eleanor had consistently prioritized thorough preparation over reactive response. Sarah returned from her livestock arrangements, pausing in the doorway, as she observed the gathered group reviewing documents at the writing desk. The tableau, an elderly woman coordinating complex contingency plans with the help of trusted associates, would have appeared extraordinary to anyone familiar with typical frontier households. Yet to Sarah, who had witnessed Eleanor's capabilities, gradually revealed over 3 years, it seemed almost natural evolution rather than shocking transformation. "Everything's prepared," she reported, closing the door behind her. "Timothy Henderson will arrive at dawn for the animals." Eleanor acknowledged this with a nod before returning her attention to Hawkins. "You should depart soon for the signal rendezvous. Robert will accompany you to the ridgeline to ensure appropriate communication with Reeves." The implication was clear. Sullivan would verify Hawkins delivered the agreed signal rather than attempting alternate communication or escape. The arrangement balanced essential verification with practical trust, creating conditions where cooperation remained Hawkins' most advantageous option. "And my men?" Hawkins inquired. "Remain here as assurance of your continued cooperation," Eleanor replied matter-of-factly. "They'll be released following confirmation that Reeves has accepted the redirection and departed toward Prescott." The terms were firm but fair, maintaining leverage without unnecessary harshness. Throughout negotiations, Eleanor had carefully balanced incentives and consequences, creating conditions where Hawkins's self-interest aligned with her objectives. As Sullivan and Hawkins prepared for departure, Martha pulled Eleanor aside, her expression conveying concern too urgent for postponement. "Wallace managed to pass a message to Riley before I separated them," she reported quietly. "Something about a backup plan if they didn't return on schedule." Eleanor absorbed this new information with the steady calculation that had served her throughout decades of managing unexpected complications. "Did you get specifics?" "Nothing concrete, but he seemed too confident for a man in his position." This subtle warning, a prisoner showing unwarranted assurance despite apparently complete containment, triggered Eleanor's well-honed instincts for detecting hidden threats. Throughout her career, she had developed acute sensitivity to behavioral inconsistencies that might signal concealed intentions or resources. "Double the watch rotations tonight," she decided, after brief consideration. "And prepare the secondary evacuation route as precaution. If Wallace has arranged additional insurance beyond Reeves, we'll need alternatives available." Martha nodded understanding before departing to implement these adjustments to their security posture. Eleanor watched her go, her expression revealing momentary contemplation of variables and contingencies beyond those already discussed. The coming hours would test arrangements decades in preparation, plans developed precisely for this possibility but never previously activated. As darkness settled more completely over Shadow Creek Valley, Eleanor West faced the most significant challenge to her carefully constructed identity since assuming it 26 years earlier. Nightshade Nora's legendary strategic acumen would need to prove its enduring value if Eleanor West hoped to preserve both her freedom and the peaceful existence she had built from the ashes of her outlaw past. The midnight sky over Shadow Creek Valley sparkled with stars, their cold light illuminating the landscape in silver and shadow. From her position at the upstairs window, Sarah could see the distant ridge where Sullivan and Hawkins had gone to signal Reeves. 2 short flashes followed by 1 longer burst of light had appeared 20 minutes earlier, the all-clear signal. As planned, inside the farmhouse, preparations continued with quiet efficiency. Eleanor had shed all pretense of frailty, moving with the fluid grace of someone decades younger as she verified final arrangements. Her transformation remained the most astonishing aspect of the day's events, not just the physical changes as she abandoned her elderly persona, but the revelations about her true identity and extraordinary past. "You should rest," Eleanor advised, finding Sarah at the window. Tomorrow will demand clear thinking and quick responses. Sarah turned from her vigil, studying the woman she had lived with for 3 years, a woman who now seemed simultaneously familiar and strange. How do you do that? Switch so completely between Eleanor West and... She hesitated before saying the name. Nightshade Nora? Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. They're not entirely separate identities, Sarah. More like different aspects of the same person, emphasized or subdued as circumstances require. She moved to join Sarah at the window. Eleanor's quieter nature, her patience and observational skills, these were always part of Nora as well, just less visible beneath more dramatic attributes. And the physical changes? The posture? The apparent weakness? Practice and discipline, Eleanor replied simply. The human body communicates primarily through unconscious signals, tension patterns, weight distribution, eye movements. Control these elements convincingly, and observers perceive what you intend them to see. This explanation, analytical and precise, reflected the methodical approach that had characterized Eleanor's operations throughout her extraordinary career. Success had come not through dramatic confrontations, but through careful preparation and psychological understanding. You've been teaching me the same skills, Sarah realized. The observation exercises, the posture adjustments, the practice. In controlling breathing during stress, it wasn't just for self-defense. Eleanor smiled slightly. Protection takes many forms. Some threats require direct resistance, others can be managed through perception and misdirection. Before Sarah could respond, they heard boots on the porch, Sullivan returning from the signal rendezvous. Eleanor moved toward the stairs, with neither the shuffling gait of Eleanor West nor the commanding stride that might have characterized Nightshade Nora, but something balanced between them, efficient movement without unnecessary flourish. In the main room, Sullivan was removing his coat while exchanging quiet words with Martha. His expression suggested successful execution rather than new complications. Signal delivered as arranged, he confirmed as Eleanor approached. Hawkins maintained his end of the bargain, at least for this stage. He's secured in the workshop for the night as agreed. And his demeanor, Eleanor inquired, attentive to behavioral nuances that might signal hidden intentions. Calculating but cooperative. He's convinced himself he's negotiated the optimal outcome from a disadvantageous position. Sullivan hung his coat by the door before continuing. I believe he'll maintain the arrangement through the Reeves meeting. After that, he shrugged slightly, leaving implications unspoken. Eleanor nodded, understanding. Men like Hawkins rarely abandoned pursuit of advantage entirely, regardless of agreements made under duress. His temporary cooperation would likely last only until circumstances shifted in his favor or alternative opportunities presented themselves. We proceed as planned, she decided. Maintain standard security rotations overnight, with additional attention to the north approach. If Reeves decides to verify Hawkins' signal personally, that's his most likely route. The directive reflected Eleanor's balanced approach to risk management, acknowledging possibilities without overcommitting resources to unlikely scenarios. Throughout her career, she had maintained this equilibrium between preparedness and practicality, avoiding both complacency and paranoia. What about Wallace's mysterious backup plan? Martha asked, returning to their earlier concern. We continue evacuation preparations while monitoring for unusual activity, Eleanor replied. Without specific information, we can only maintain heightened awareness while proceeding with established contingencies. This pragmatic response, acknowledging threat potential without allowing it to derail necessary actions, demonstrated the decision-making clarity that had made Nightshade Nora so effective during her years evading territorial authorities. As the others moved to implement overnight security arrangements, Sarah found herself alone with Eleanor in the main room. Questions that had accumulated throughout the extraordinary day now pressed for answers, though she hesitated to intrude on matters Eleanor had kept private for decades. "You must have questions," Eleanor observed, recognizing Sarah's internal conflict. "Tonight might be the appropriate time to address some of them, given tomorrow's uncertainties." The invitation, offered without pressure or defensiveness, reflected the trust that had developed between them over 3 years of shared living. Though their relationship had been built on partial truths and selective disclosures, its foundation remained authentic. "Why did you take me in?" Sarah asked, selecting the question most personally significant from many possibilities. 3 years ago, when I arrived here bloody and terrified. Why risk your security for a stranger?" Eleanor settled into her rocking chair, gesturing for Sarah to join her. When she spoke, her voice carried neither the quaver of Eleanor West nor the commanding tone of Nightshade Nora, but something more fundamental than either persona. "I recognized something in you that reminded me of myself at a similar crossroads," she explained. "Not the specifics of your circumstances, but the underlying pattern, a woman forced to choose between continued victimization and potentially dangerous action." Sarah nodded slowly, remembering that terrible night when she had finally fought back against her abusive husband Davis, leaving him bleeding on their cabin floor as she fled into the darkness. She had stumbled upon Shadow Creek farmhouse by chance, or so she had believed until now. "You knew who I was before I arrived," she realized, connecting previously isolated details. "The preparations you'd made, the clothes that happened to fit me, the spare room already arranged." "I knew of you," Eleanor clarified. "Martha had mentioned a young woman in an increasingly dangerous situation during her visits to the general store. Robert had observed Davis Taylor's escalating behavior in town. I made certain arrangements. As precaution, though the specific timing of your arrival remained unpredictable." This revelation, that her chance discovery of Sanctuary had actually been part of Eleanor's methodical contingency planning, shifted Sarah's understanding of their entire relationship. What had seemed like spontaneous compassion toward a desperate stranger now appeared as calculated intervention based on systematic information gathering. "You've been watching over the entire valley all these years," Sarah said, comprehension dawning. "Not just protecting your identity, but monitoring everything happening within your territory." "Information provides security," Eleanor confirmed. "Simply, understanding patterns and relationships allows anticipation rather than mere reaction. It's a practice I developed during my previous life and maintained afterward, though applied toward different purposes." This continuity between Nightshade Nora's operational methods and Eleanor West's quiet vigilance highlighted how the transformation between identities represented evolution rather than complete reinvention. The analytical mind that had orchestrated legendary bank robberies had redirected its capabilities toward creating and maintaining peaceful sanctuary rather than abandoning them entirely. "Is that why you taught me to shoot? To read maps and track movement patterns? Because you saw something of yourself in me?" Eleanor considered this thoughtfully before responding. "I taught you those skills because every woman deserves the capacity for self-determination, regardless of men's intentions toward her. Whether that determination leads toward paths similar to mine remains entirely your choice." Before Sarah could pursue this further, Sullivan returned from his security check, his expression suggesting new developments requiring immediate attention. "Rider approaching from the east," he reported without preamble. "Single horseman moving, cautiously, too dark to identify, but definitely not Reeves or his full team based on the approach pattern." Eleanor rose immediately, all traces of philosophical reflection replaced by tactical focus. "Distance and estimated arrival?" 2 miles out, following the creek bed rather than the main trail. 15 minutes, perhaps 20 if they maintain current caution. This unexpected approach, a single rider using natural terrain features for concealed movement, represented potential complication to their carefully arranged plans with Hawkins. The timing and method suggested either advanced reconnaissance from Reeves or an entirely separate party with their own objectives regarding Shadow Creek. "Martha, please alert our guests in the cellar to maintain absolute silence," Eleanor directed, her tone calm but authoritative. "Sarah, retrieve the field glasses from the gun cabinet and join me in the east attic. Robert, position yourself near the barn with clear sight lines to the creek approach." These rapid-fire instructions, delivered without hesitation or uncertainty, revealed the command presence that had once made Nightshade Nora the most successful outlaw leader in territorial history. Each directive addressed specific tactical requirements, while maintaining overall strategic coherence, protecting their position while gathering essential intelligence about the unidentified threat. As the others moved to execute her instructions, Eleanor retrieved a lever-action Winchester from its concealed position behind the kitchen pantry. Her handling of the weapon displayed practiced familiarity, checking the loading mechanism and ammunition with efficient movements that required no conscious attention. Sarah returned with the field glasses, her own demeanor now reflecting the calm competence Eleanor had cultivated in her through 3 years of subtle training. Together they ascended to the east attic via a narrow staircase concealed within what appeared to be a linen closet, another of the farmhouse's many architectural deceptions. The attic space had been converted into an observation post offering commanding views of the surrounding terrain through specially designed apertures. In the gabled roof, these openings, virtually invisible from outside, provided extensive sightlines while maintaining the concealment of anyone positioned within. Eleanor positioned herself at the eastern opening, field glasses trained on the creek bed where willow trees created intermittent visual cover for anyone approaching from that direction. Sarah took position at the southern aperture, creating overlapping observation zones that eliminated potential blind spots. "Movement at the creek bend," Eleanor reported quietly, her tone clinically precise. "Single rider as Robert indicated. Male, medium build. Rifle scabbard visible, though the weapon remained secured." Sarah adjusted her position slightly, seeking the angle that might reveal the rider's approach, point toward the farmhouse. "He's following the game trail that connects to our eastern pasture," she observed. "Deliberate approach rather than casual wandering." This assessment, tactical rather than merely descriptive, demonstrated how effectively Sarah had absorbed Eleanor's teachings about security awareness and threat evaluation. What had begun as basic self-defense instruction had evolved into more comprehensive training in situational analysis and response planning. "The horse is struggling slightly with the terrain," Eleanor noted, adjusting the field glasses for better focus. "Not a mount accustomed to creek beds and underbrush. This isn't someone familiar with local hunting routes." This detail, seemingly minor but potentially significant, reflected Eleanor's attention to contextual indicators that might reveal a subject's background and intentions. Throughout her career, such observational precision had provided crucial advantages during both planning and execution phases of her operations. As the rider emerged from the creek bed into moonlight, Eleanor's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Joseph Blackwell," she identified, her voice betraying no emotion despite the significance of this recognition. "Hawkins' informant, the one who told them about this place?" Sarah asked, shifting position to catch sight of the approaching figure. "And my former brother-in-law," Eleanor confirmed, lowering the field glasses. "Richard's younger brother who rode with the Nightshade gang until his capture in '71. The unexpected arrival of Joseph Blackwell." a direct connection to Nightshade. Nora's outlaw past represented significant complication to their already complex situation. His presence suggested either independent pursuit of the Tucson gold or potential connection to Wallace's mysterious backup plan mentioned earlier. "He's heading directly for the farmhouse," Sarah observed, not reconnoitering or approaching cautiously as you'd expect from someone uncertain of his reception. "Because he believes Hawkins and his men have already secured the property." Eleanor concluded, her tactical assessment immediate and precise. "This is their insurance policy. Joseph arrives to identify me and verify the gold's existence after initial containment." This deduction, connecting Joseph's approach pattern with Wallace's earlier confidence despite captivity, demonstrated Eleanor's ability to synthesize disparate information into coherent tactical understanding. Throughout her career, this capability had allowed her to anticipate opponent movements and adapt accordingly. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her tone reflecting readiness rather than alarm. Eleanor considered their options with the measured calculation that had characterized her decision-making throughout decades of managing dangerous circumstances. Joseph Blackwell represented both immediate tactical challenge and potential strategic opportunity, a direct connection to her past who might provide critical information about broader threats to her carefully constructed present. "We adjust our approach," she decided after brief consideration. Robert intercepts Joseph before he reaches the house, bringing him inside under controlled circumstances. We learn what he knows about Hawkins' arrangements with Reeves and any other parties who might be pursuing the Tucson gold. The plan reflected Eleanor's preference for information gathering over immediate confrontation when circumstances permitted. Throughout her career as Nightshade Nora, she had prioritized intelligence acquisition before committing to specific courses of action, an approach that had contributed significantly to her unprecedented success rate. Sarah nodded understanding, already moving toward the attic stairs to relay instructions to Sullivan. Her response, anticipating implementation requirements without needing explicit direction, demonstrated how thoroughly she had internalized Eleanor's operational methods during their 3 years together. Alone in the observation post, Eleanor watched Joseph Blackwell's approach with complex emotions, carefully contained beneath tactical focus. The man below represented a direct connection to her previous life, someone who had known her as Nora rather than Eleanor, who had ridden with the Nightshade gang during its most active period, who had shared Richard's blood and some of his idealism before diverging toward his own path. Last seen in a territorial courtroom 27 years earlier, Joseph had aged significantly during his prison years. His once dark hair had gone completely grey, his formerly upright posture now slightly stupid, yet his approach to the farmhouse maintained some elements of the man Eleanor had known: deliberate movement, careful environmental scanning, and a balanced seat in the saddle despite rough terrain. Through the field glasses, she could discern elements of Richard in his features, the shared bone structure apparent despite the passage of years and hardship of incarceration. The resemblance stirred memories long compartmentalized. Richard's passion for justice that had inspired the Nightshade gang's original formation, his tactical brilliance that had shaped their early operations, his death that had transformed their mission from idealistic crusade to something more complex and personal. Movement near the barn caught her attention as Sullivan emerged from shadow, shotgun held casually but visibly as he intercepted Joseph's approach. The exchange appeared briefly tense before resolving into conversation, followed by Joseph dismounting under Sullivan's watchful supervision. Eleanor descended from the observation post, her movements deliberate as she prepared to confront this unexpected visitor from her past. Beyond the immediate tactical implications, Joseph's arrival forced reconciliation between identities she had kept separated for decades. Nightshade Nora's history and associations intersecting directly with Eleanor West's carefully constructed present. In the main room, Martha had prepared for Joseph's arrival by securing potential weapons and positioning herself to observe while maintaining defensive advantage if needed. Her expression suggested concern about this development while maintaining professional composure. "Robert's bringing him in," Eleanor informed her, checking the Winchester's loading once more before positioning it near her chair. Visible as a deterrent, but not immediately in hand. "We'll need to adjust our timeline based on what he reveals." "About coordination with Hawkins and Reeves," Martha nodded understanding, her own hand remaining near the pocket where Eleanor knew she kept a derringer, a defensive habit maintained from their outlaw days despite decades of peaceful living. "Should we wake Hawkins for this conversation?" Martha asked, her tone suggesting tactical assessment rather than genuine inquiry. "Not immediately," Eleanor decided. "Let's determine Joseph's understanding of the situation and his specific objectives before revealing our arrangements with Hawkins. Information asymmetry provides tactical advantage until proven otherwise. This approach, controlling information flow to maintain negotiating leverage, reflected practice developed during Eleanor's years coordinating the Nightshade Gang's operations across multiple territories. Throughout her career, she had recognized that information often proved more valuable than physical resources in determining operational outcomes. The front door opened under Sullivan's supervision, revealing Joseph Blackwell in full light for the first time. His trail clothing showed signs of hard travel, dust coating his boots and lower trousers. The gray hair visible beneath his wide-brimmed hat was cropped short, institutional style suggesting recent release from incarceration. His expression registered shock as he caught sight of Eleanor, confirmation visible in his eyes despite her significant transformation since they had last met. "Hello, Joseph," Eleanor greeted him, her voice neither Eleanor West's quaver nor Nightshade. Nora's command, but something authentic beneath both personas. "It's been quite some time." Joseph's weathered face displayed complex emotions: recognition, disbelief, calculation, and something resembling twisted satisfaction. "They said you died at the border," he replied, his voice roughened by years and hard living. "Shot by marshals while trying to reach Mexico. There was a funeral and everything." "Convenient narratives serve multiple interests," Eleanor observed. Matter-of-factly, "The marshals claimed credit for closing a high-profile case. I gained freedom from pursuit, a mutually beneficial arrangement, all things considered." Joseph smiled thinly, though the expression held little warmth. "Always the pragmatist, Nora. Or do you prefer Eleanor now?" His gaze swept the room, assessing occupants and exits with the habitual wariness of someone accustomed to confined spaces. "Nice setup you've established here. Comfortable, secure." "It has served its purpose," Eleanor acknowledged, gesturing toward a chair positioned where both Sullivan and Martha could maintain clear observation. "Please, sit. You've had a long ride, and we have much to discuss regarding your recent conversations with Benjamin Hawkins." The invitation, delivered as casual courtesy rather than direct confrontation, established Eleanor's control of the interaction while acknowledging Joseph's physical requirements after extended travel. Throughout her career, she had recognized the psychological advantage gained through such calculated hospitality, creating implied obligation while maintaining position dominance. Joseph remained standing, his posture suggesting wariness despite his apparent confidence. "Where is Hawkins? He and his men should have secured this place hours ago." "Mr. Hawkins and his associates are currently indisposed," Eleanor replied evenly. "Their approach proved less effective than anticipated, rather like your own arrival." Just now, the information landed with visible impact as Joseph reassessed the situation. His hand drifted unconsciously toward his hip before recalling that Sullivan had relieved him of his sidearm during their initial encounter outside. "You seem surprised," Eleanor observed, her tone conversational despite the tense circumstances. "Did you genuinely believe a handful of opportunistic bounty hunters could successfully capture Nightshade Nora? Even after 26 years, certain fundamental principles remain operational." This subtle reminder of her historical capabilities, delivered without explicit threat but clear in implication, shifted the dynamic further. Joseph's expression reflected recalculation as he recognized his position had deteriorated from anticipated advantage to potential vulnerability. "You always were 3 steps ahead," he acknowledged grudgingly, finally accepting the offered chair. "Should have remembered that before opening my mouth in that saloon." "Indeed," Eleanor agreed mildly, "though I'm curious what prompted that particular indiscretion after maintaining silence throughout your incarceration. 15 years is impressive restraint to abandon so casually." The question addressed practical intelligence gathering while probing psychological motivation, both critical elements for Eleanor's tactical assessment. Understanding why Joseph had revealed information about Shadow Creek after years of silence would provide insight into his current objectives and potential leverage points for negotiation. Joseph's expression hardened, resentment briefly visible beneath calculated composure. 15 years in Yuma while you lived in comfort," he replied, bitterness evident despite attempted control. "Seemed inequitable given our relative contributions to the operation." This response, framing his actions as perceived justice rather than simple betrayal, provided valuable insight into Joseph's psychological state and potential negotiating positions. Throughout her career, Eleanor had recognized that understanding an opponent's internal narrative often proved more valuable than focusing exclusively on external behaviors. "You believe I owed you protection from consequences," Eleanor observed, her tone analytical rather than accusatory, "despite the fact that your capture resulted from independent action against direct instruction." The reference to historical conflict between them, Joseph's unauthorized stage robbery attempt that had led to his capture and subsequent imprisonment, elevated tension in the room. Sullivan shifted position slightly, maintaining defensive readiness while accommodating the evolving conversation. "I believe family should stand together," Joseph countered, his gaze intent on Eleanor's face. "Richard would never have abandoned me to rot in that hellhole." The invocation of her late husband's name struck deliberately at emotional vulnerability, though Eleanor's expression revealed nothing beyond attentive consideration. Throughout decades of maintaining her concealed identity, she had developed extraordinary control over visible emotional responses, a discipline that had served both Nightshade Nora and Eleanor West in their respective circumstances. "Richard died before your capture," she replied evenly. "Speculation about his hypothetical actions serves little purpose now. More relevant is your current coordination with Hawkins and potentially others regarding Shadow Creek." This redirection, moving from emotional provocation back to practical intelligence gathering, reflected Eleanor's consistent prioritization throughout her extraordinary career. Personal feelings, however justified, remained secondary to operational requirements and strategic objectives. Joseph studied her with narrowed eyes, apparently reassessing based on her controlled response. "You've changed, Nora. The woman I knew would have put a bullet in me the moment I crossed your property line." "Experience modifies approach," Eleanor acknowledged simply. "Nightshade Nora's methods served specific circumstances. Eleanor West's priorities differ accordingly." This distinction, presented not as fundamental transformation but as contextual adaptation, revealed Eleanor's integrated understanding of her complex identity. The personas she had developed and inhabited represented strategic responses to different environmental requirements, rather than entirely separate selves. Your current circumstances appear to require reconsideration of peaceful methods, Joseph observed with grim satisfaction. Hawkins was just the advance party. Reeves brings significantly more firepower, and he's not the only one pursuing the Tucson gold after all these years. This confirmation of expanded threat beyond their existing intelligence suggested Joseph possessed information potentially critical to their security planning. Throughout her career, Eleanor had recognized the value of comprehensive threat assessment before finalizing operational decisions. "Perhaps we should discuss exactly what you told Hawkins," she suggested, her tone conversational despite the implied interrogation. "And more importantly, what you've shared with others regarding Shadow Creek and its residents." The invitation to detailed disclosure, framed as collaborative conversation rather than hostile demand, created space for potential cooperation while maintaining clear power dynamics within the interaction. Throughout her extraordinary career, Eleanor had recognized that information extraction often proceeded more effectively through calculated engagement than through direct confrontation or threat. Joseph's response would determine not just the immediate tactical situation, but potentially reshape Eleanor's decades-long sanctuary in ways that neither Nightshade, Nora, nor Eleanor West could have fully anticipated during their carefully separated existences. The eastern sky had begun to lighten with pre-dawn glow as Eleanor, Sullivan, and Joseph reached their observation position on the ridge overlooking Shadow Creek Valley. Eleanor positioned herself behind a natural formation of granite boulders that provided both concealment and wind protection, her field glasses already trained on the valley below. Reeves typically deploys advanced scouts 30 minutes before primary movement, Joseph explained, settling beside her, while Sullivan maintained watchful proximity. Two-man teams, usually former cavalry with tracking experience. Eleanor adjusted her field glasses, focusing on the eastern approach. Preferred communication methods? Hand signals within visual range, mirror flashes for longer distances. Joseph replied. He maintains strict noise discipline during initial deployment, another carryover from his Pinkerton methodology. Movement at the creek junction, Sullivan reported quietly. 2 riders, moving deliberately rather than at pace, deploying into observation positions rather than advancing directly. Eleanor adjusted her own field glasses to observe the described movement, noting specific deployment patterns. Pinkerton's standard procedure: secure advanced positions before committing main force, establish observation triangulation for complete coverage, Joseph nodded. Reeves maintains 6 shooters in his primary team, plus the 2 scouts we're observing. Professional men rather than opportunistic thugs like Hawkins assembled. And their specific objective regarding Shadow Creek, Eleanor prompted. Capture rather than elimination, Joseph replied without hesitation. Reeves operates on bounty recovery parameters. You're worth substantially more alive for formal identification and interrogation regarding remaining Nightshade operations. Sullivan shifted position slightly. Second team deploying from the north, establishing cross-valley observation capability. Your intelligence regarding Reeves appears accurate, Eleanor acknowledged. Now expand on Carson's approach. You indicated the southern vector with sunrise timing? Joseph hesitated briefly, his gaze remaining fixed on the eastern approach. Carson maintains a less structured methodology, former military but adapted for prison context, unpredictable timing with emphasis on overwhelming force rather than tactical sophistication. You seem less certain about Carson's specific deployment than Reeves, she observed mildly. Joseph's expression remained carefully neutral. Carson shares information selectively, particularly regarding operational timing. Trust issues developed during his incarceration. Yet you coordinated his approach with sufficient precision to ensure arrival within this specific time frame, she noted, suggesting more detailed knowledge than you've disclosed regarding his movement pattern. Joseph shifted uncomfortably, estimated arrival windows rather than exact timing. Carson establishes his own schedule regardless of coordination attempts. I believe enhanced verification regarding Carson's approach would be appropriate, Eleanor decided. Robert, please signal Martha to intensify southern perimeter monitoring while we maintain observation here. Sullivan nodded, producing a small mirror from his pocket for the prearranged signaling protocol they had established for communication between observation posts. As Sullivan positioned the mirror to catch early sunlight for transmission, Joseph's demeanor shifted subtly, tension indicators increasing despite attempted concealment. Second Reeves' scout team has established a position overlooking the northern approach road, Eleanor reported. Triangulation patterns suggest main force deployment within 30 minutes if standard Pinkerton methodology applies. We should return to the farmhouse, Joseph suggested with deliberate casualness that failed to mask underlying urgency. Prepare defensive positions before Reeves commits his main force. Maintaining observation provides critical intelligence regarding Reeves's deployment pattern, she countered smoothly. Martha and Sarah have preliminary defenses prepared according to established protocol. Joseph's expression tightened briefly. Carson presents a greater immediate threat than Reeves. Professional bounty hunters follow predictable methodology. Carson's prison-hardened approach introduces substantial variables requiring direct management. Sullivan's signal will ensure appropriate monitoring of southern approaches, she replied evenly. Our position here provides superior tactical intelligence regarding Reeves's deployment that alternative positions would sacrifice. Martha confirms reception, Sullivan reported as he completed his mirror signaling. The acknowledgement appeared to trigger a decision point for Joseph, whose expression shifted from controlled neutrality toward resigned calculation. His hand moved subtly toward his boot top, where Eleanor had noted a slight bulge suggesting a concealed weapon. I'm afraid we have a scheduling problem, he said, dropping the pretense of continued cooperation. Carson isn't approaching from the south, as I indicated earlier. Eleanor maintained outward calm, despite immediate tactical reassessment. Indeed, perhaps you'd care to provide accurate information regarding his actual approach vector. Joseph's smile carried no warmth as he withdrew a small derringer from his boot concealment. Carson arrived yesterday afternoon, currently preparing a coordinated approach with Reeves rather than competing, as I previously suggested. Coordinated rather than competitive, she acknowledged, her tone conveying professional assessment rather than alarm despite the weapon now directed toward her. Explains certain inconsistencies in your earlier narrative. Joseph's expression reflected surprise at her measured response. Carson offering a percentage to Reeves proved more profitable than maintaining separate operations. Combined approach eliminates inefficient competition while ensuring superior tactical advantage against your admittedly impressive defenses. And your personal arrival at Shadow Creek? Eleanor prompted, maintaining conversational engagement, while assessing response options. Insurance policy, he acknowledged simply. Carson remains somewhat unpredictable regarding former associates. My presence ensures adherence to agreed terms regarding distribution of recovered assets. As he spoke, a distant mirror flash from the farmhouse caught Eleanor's peripheral vision, Martha signaling urgent development requiring immediate attention. The signal pattern indicated approach from unexpected vectors rather than previously monitored directions. It appears your insurance arrangement may face immediate test, Eleanor observed calmly. Complex coordinations involving multiple parties with conflicting histories rarely proceed according to initial agreements, particularly when significant assets motivate potential reinterpretation of terms. As Joseph began responding to her assessment, Sullivan made his move with explosive speed. His massive hand closed around Joseph's wrist, immobilizing the derringer before it could be redirected from Eleanor toward this new threat. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the ground as Sullivan completed his disarmament, securing both. Joseph and the derringer with practiced efficiency. It appears verification has indeed provided valuable intelligence, Eleanor observed mildly, rising from her observation position with fluid grace. Though not precisely as you intended, Joseph. The eastern sky had brightened significantly during their confrontation, dawnlight now illuminating the valley below, where Reeves's scouts maintained their observation positions. From the farmhouse, additional mirror signals indicated multiple approach vectors now actively monitored. Carson's forces apparently deploying according to the coordinated plan Joseph had reluctantly revealed. "We should return immediately," Sullivan stated, securing Joseph with efficient restraint that ensured both containment and mobility for their necessary withdrawal. Martha's signal indicates multiple approach vectors active simultaneously. Eleanor nodded agreement, her tactical assessment already processing implications of this coordinated assault against previous planning assumptions. "It seems our peaceful retirement faces a somewhat more substantial challenge than initially anticipated," she observed with calm understatement. As they began their cautious descent from the observation point, Eleanor's mind processed tactical adjustments required. By this fundamental intelligence revision, Carson and Reeves, operating in coordination rather than competition, transformed their defensive requirements significantly. Sophisticated planning combined with prison-hardened brutality created a threat profile exceeding either approach individually. The Shadow Creek Valley confrontation had entered a new phase, requiring integration of all capabilities developed throughout Eleanor's extraordinary lifetime, Nightshade Nora's tactical brilliance, and Eleanor West's patient strategic thinking, now fully united against a threat that targeted both aspects of her complex identity simultaneously. The sun had fully risen over Shadow Creek Valley by the time Eleanor, Sullivan, and their reluctant captive Joseph reached the edge of the farmhouse property. From their elevated approach, they could see multiple riders converging on the homestead from different directions, Reeves' main force advancing with professional discipline from the east, while another group moved with less structured formation. From the western ridge, likely Carson and his prison-hardened crew. 8 men with Reeves, Sullivan counted through his field glasses. Another 5 approaching from the west, professional coordination rather than casual convergence. Eleanor absorbed this tactical assessment with the calm clarity that had defined her leadership throughout her extraordinary career. The combined force significantly exceeded their defensive capacity under normal circumstances. 13 experienced fighters with specific knowledge of their target presented formidable challenges, even for Nightshade Nora's legendary planning. "They're implementing standard containment patterns," she observed, noting the deployment geometry developing around the farmhouse, establishing overlapping fields of fire while preventing unobserved withdrawal from any direction. Joseph, secure, in Sullivan's restraining grip, displayed the first genuine emotion since his deception had been revealed, concern rather than calculated confidence. "This formation exceeds our agreement," he noted, his tone betraying uncertainty. Carson was supposed to maintain a direct approach rather than flanking deployment. "Honor among thieves proving predictably unreliable," Eleanor commented dryly. "Perhaps your insurance policy requires adjustment." Before Joseph could respond, a mirror flash from the barn caught their attention. Martha signaling recognition of their approach and acknowledging the tactical situation developing around the property. The signal pattern indicated defensive, Preparations completed according to contingency planning previously established. Eleanor's meticulous preparation for potential discovery now implemented under actual threat conditions. Martha has activated the Clearwater Protocol, Sullivan interpreted, recognizing their long-established emergency code. Primary defenses in place, evacuation preparations complete. Eleanor nodded approval, her tactical assessment already integrating this confirmation with observed enemy deployment. We approach through the North Ravine, she decided, identifying the narrow depression that provided concealed access to the root cellar entrance. It remains outside their current observation pattern based on visible positioning. Sullivan guided Joseph toward the indicated route with firm efficiency, maintaining control while avoiding unnecessary harshness. Despite Joseph's betrayal, Eleanor had established clear parameters regarding treatment of captives, another ethical boundary maintained consistently throughout her extraordinary career, regardless of context or provocation. "They'll kill you, you know," Joseph said quietly, as they moved through a concealed brush toward the ravine entrance. Carson spent 16 years planning exactly how he'd end Nightshade Nora. Reeves might want you alive for bounty purposes, but Carson's motivation transcends financial consideration. Vengeance rarely provides satisfaction proportional to effort invested, Eleanor replied, her tone suggesting philosophical observation rather than personal concern. A lesson experience teaches repeatedly, though few seem to absorb its implication. This measured response, addressing conceptual principle rather than emotional reaction, reflected Eleanor's consistent approach throughout decades of managing dangerous circumstances. From her earliest days leading the Nightshade Gang through her current crisis at Shadow Creek, she had maintained an analytical perspective that transcended immediate threat perception. As they approached the concealed entrance to the root cellar, tunnel gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the farmhouse, Carson's men apparently initiating engagement despite Reeves's more measured containment approach. The disciplined response from within the structure suggested Martha and Sarah had implemented defensive protocols effectively, maintaining controlled fire rather than panicked reaction. Carson's impatience undermines tactical advantage, Eleanor observed as Sullivan secured the hidden entrance hatch. Premature engagement before complete containment established provides defense valuable response preparation time. This professional assessment, focusing on opponent error rather than personal danger, demonstrated the tactical clarity that had made Nightshade Nora legendary during her operational career. Even under direct attack, her analytical perspective remained focused on opportunity identification rather than threat magnification. The root cellar tunnel, excavated years earlier as a contingency evacuation route, extended approximately 30 yards from its concealed exterior entrance to the reinforced storage area beneath the farmhouse kitchen. Eleanor had designed this passage with characteristic attention to detail, sufficient height for comfortable movement, timber reinforcement at structural stress points, and a subtle air circulation system that prevented both staleness and excessive draft that might reveal its existence. Sarah will maintain southeast corner defense, while Martha coordinates potential withdrawal through the western tunnel, Eleanor explained, as they moved efficiently through the passage. Hawkins remains secured in the workshop, with his men contained in the stone cellar, neutralized variables until immediate tactical situation resolves. This operational briefing, concise yet comprehensive, reflected Eleanor's consistent leadership approach throughout her extraordinary career. Essential information transmitted clearly without unnecessary elaboration, focusing team awareness on critical elements requiring immediate action or decision. As they reached the tunnel terminus, Sullivan secured Joseph in a side chamber designed specifically for temporary containment, another example of Eleanor's meticulous contingency planning. The space included basic amenities for humane confinement, while ensuring security through substantial construction and concealed access. "You'll remain here while we address the current tactical situation," Eleanor informed Joseph matter-of-factly. "Consider your position carefully during that interval, particularly regarding potential value as information source versus liability requiring permanent resolution." This statement, delivered without explicit threat yet carrying unmistakable implication, reflected Eleanor's balanced approach to captive management throughout her extraordinary career. Clear parameters established without excessive elaboration, focusing on practical consequences rather than emotional intimidation. As they ascended from the root cellar into the farmhouse kitchen, they found Martha reloading a Winchester rifle with practiced efficiency, her expression conveying situation update without requiring verbalization. The disciplined defensive fire they had heard from outside continued with a structured pattern, suggesting tactical response rather than desperate resistance. "Carson's men attempted to approach through the eastern pasture," she reported concisely. "Sarah discouraged their enthusiasm with impressive marksmanship. Reeves maintains professional containment without direct engagement thus far, though his position development suggests imminent coordinated action." Joseph confirmed coordination between Carson and Reeves rather than competition as originally reported, Eleanor explained, accepting the loaded revolver Martha handed her with automatic familiarity. Combined operation with shared objective, but potentially conflicting methods based on their distinctive operational histories. This mutual briefing, exchanging essential information without unnecessary elaboration, demonstrated the professional integration that had characterized their partnership throughout decades of shared experience. From their earliest days with the Nightshade Gang through their current life at Shadow Creek, they had maintained communication efficiency that maximized tactical awareness while minimizing extraneous detail. "Hawkins?" Eleanor asked, her single word, a query encompassing multiple potential concerns regarding their original captive and his status during this escalated situation. "Secure but informed," Martha replied, with equal efficiency. "I explained developing circumstances and presented a conditional proposition regarding potential cooperation. His response remains under consideration pending observation of immediate tactical developments." This approach, creating potential alliances with former adversaries based on shared interest regarding new threats, reflected Eleanor's consistent strategic flexibility throughout her extraordinary career. Tactical relationships established based on calculated advantage rather than emotional reaction, recognizing that yesterday's opponent might become today's ally through proper incentive alignment. A brief lull in the gunfire provided opportunity to move toward the main room where Sarah maintained defensive position at the reinforced window frame. Her posture displayed the trained discipline Eleanor had cultivated over their 3 years together, proper cover utilization with minimal exposure during observation, controlled breathing pattern to maintain steady aim, and efficient ammunition management rather than excessive expenditure. "2 men down in the eastern pasture," she reported, without turning from her position. "Reeves has established containment points at all approach routes, but maintains disciplined fire restriction despite Carson's aggressive engagement attempts." This tactical reporting, focusing on observable facts rather than speculative interpretation, demonstrated how thoroughly Sarah had absorbed Eleanor's training methodology during their time together. Information delivery prioritized actionable intelligence over emotional reaction or unnecessary elaboration, maintaining communication efficiency under stress conditions. Carson appears to be forcing Reeves's engagement timeline through aggressive action, Eleanor observed, her tactical assessment integrating multiple information sources into coherent situation analysis, creating operational friction within their supposed alliance through conflicting methodologies. This identification of opponent internal conflict, recognizing exploitable division within an apparently unified enemy force, reflected the strategic insight that had made Nightshade Nora legendary during her operational career. Throughout decades of managing dangerous circumstances, she had consistently identified leverage points that less experienced tacticians might overlook during crisis response. "We have approximately 18 minutes before Reeves commits his main force," Eleanor continued, her assessment based on observed deployment patterns and historical knowledge of Pinkerton methodology. His professional discipline prevents premature engagement despite Carson's provocations, but containment establishment will complete within that time frame. This precise timeline estimation, specific rather than general, reflected Eleanor's extraordinary tactical experience throughout her remarkable career. Pattern recognition developed through decades of engagement with similar methodologies allowed predictive assessment that created planning advantage despite challenging circumstances. "Options?" Sullivan asked. The single word encompassing complete tactical inquiry without requiring elaborate articulation. "Limited but viable," Eleanor replied with equal efficiency. "Our defensive capacity cannot sustain extended engagement against a combined professional force of this magnitude. Tactical withdrawal through Western Tunnel provides optimal survival probability for all principals." This clear-eyed assessment, acknowledging reality without emotional distortion, had characterized Eleanor's leadership throughout her extraordinary career. Facing situations objectively, rather than through pride or wishful thinking, had contributed significantly to her unprecedented success rate during both Nightshade operations and subsequent challenges. "The gold?" Martha asked, her question addressing practical logistics rather than emotional attachment to material resources. Transport capacity limited to essential distribution previously prepared in evacuation packs, Eleanor decided without hesitation. Remaining assets concealed according to established protocol for potential future recovery if circumstances permit. This prioritization, focusing on personnel's survival rather than resource preservation, reflected consistent values maintained throughout Eleanor's remarkable lifetime. From her earliest days leading the Nightshade Gang through her current crisis management, she had consistently valued human welfare above material consideration when circumstances forced such choices. "And Hawkins' men?" Sarah inquired, demonstrating developing tactical awareness beyond immediate defensive responsibility. Eleanor considered this question with characteristic thoroughness despite time pressure. Release with minimal resources but sufficient guidance toward alternative evacuation routes, she decided after brief consideration. Their presence creates tactical distraction potentially beneficial to our withdrawal execution while avoiding unnecessary casualties through abandoned confinement. This balanced approach, addressing both practical advantage and ethical consideration, exemplified Eleanor's consistent operational philosophy throughout her extraordinary career. Tactical necessity acknowledged without abandoning fundamental principles regarding appropriate treatment of even adversarial parties when circumstances permitted humane alternatives. As they finalized evacuation preparations, intensified gunfire indicated Carson's growing impatience with the standoff situation. The aggressive fusillade struck the reinforced windows and door frames with minimal penetration, another vindication of Eleanor's meticulous structural preparation during the farmhouse construction years earlier. Carson's tactical discipline deteriorating, Sullivan observed, his professional assessment focusing on opponent psychological indicators rather than simply material threat. Ammunition expenditure exceeds rational engagement parameters given known supply limitations. Emotional investment overriding tactical judgment, Eleanor agreed, recognizing the operational advantage created by this opponent's vulnerability. creating potential diversionary opportunities during withdrawal implementation. This identification of exploitable psychological factors, opponent emotional state creating tactical opportunity, reflected Eleanor's comprehensive approach to situation assessment throughout her extraordinary career. Beyond merely material calculations regarding weapons and positions, she consistently integrated human factors that often proved decisive in actual operational outcomes. Martha emerged from the storage room carrying 3 canvas packs designed specifically for evacuation scenarios. Another example of Eleanor's meticulous contingency planning. Each contained survival essentials, identification documents for alternative identities, and carefully selected financial resources sufficient for establishment of a new operational base if necessary. Western Tunnel clear based on perimeter monitoring, she reported, her focus remaining on mission-critical information despite the escalating crisis atmosphere. Withdrawal route established through Pine Ridge with subsequent transportation arrangements accessible from Northern Trail Junction. This operational readiness, methodical preparation despite emotional pressure, demonstrated the disciplined approach Eleanor had cultivated throughout her extraordinary organization. From their earliest days with the Nightshade Gang through, their current crisis management emphasis remained on controlled execution rather than reactive response, regardless of circumstance intensity. "We should consider Joseph's disposition," Sullivan noted, as final preparations reached completion. His knowledge regarding Carson and Reeves creates significant security vulnerability if interrogated effectively. This consideration, addressing long-term security implications beyond immediate tactical situation, reflected the comprehensive perspective Eleanor had established throughout her extraordinary organization. Strategic thinking was maintained even during tactical crises, ensuring decisions addressed both immediate requirements and future implications. "Bring him," Eleanor decided after brief consideration. His value as an information source regarding pursuit organization exceeds vulnerability risk given appropriate management protocols. This balanced assessment, weighing multiple factors rather than focusing exclusively on single consideration, exemplified Eleanor's decision methodology throughout her remarkable career. Comprehensive evaluation, incorporating various perspectives rather than reactive judgment based on limited factors, especially during crisis situations where emotional response might otherwise override rational assessment. Sarah adjusted her position to maintain defensive coverage while preparations continued, her expression betraying brief concern, quickly controlled through disciplined focus. "What about Carson's vendetta?" she asked, the question addressing underlying motivational factors rather than merely tactical consideration. "If he's invested 16 years in pursuing Nightshade Nora, withdrawal merely postpones inevitable continuation." The question, addressing root cause rather than symptomatic manifestation, demonstrated Sarah's developing strategic thinking beyond tactical execution. During their 3 years together, Eleanor had cultivated this analytical depth through both direct instruction and observed example, encouraging integration of multiple perspective levels when assessing complex situations. "Carson pursues shadow rather than substance," Eleanor replied thoughtfully despite situation urgency. "His 16-year vendetta targets persona abandoned decades earlier, shaped by prison-distorted memories rather than current reality. The woman he seeks no longer exists in a meaningful sense beyond historical reference." This philosophical response, addressing conceptual understanding rather than merely practical tactics, revealed the integrated perspective Eleanor had developed throughout her extraordinary lifetime. Beyond operational effectiveness or strategic planning, she had established a philosophical framework that provided contextual meaning for experiences spanning remarkable transformation from legendary outlaw to respected community member. Yet, here we stand preparing evacuation based on his arrival, Sarah noted with perceptive insight that reflected her developing analytical capability. Eleanor smiled briefly, genuine appreciation for the legitimate observation transcending the immediate crisis atmosphere. True integration requires acknowledging all aspects of our experience without being defined exclusively by any isolated element, she explained. Nightshade Nora's tactical capabilities serve present necessity without requiring resurrection of complete historical identity. This perspective, integration rather than compartmentalization, represented Eleanor's evolved understanding after decades of remarkable experience across dramatically different life circumstances, rather than maintaining rigid separation between Nightshade Nora and Eleanor West as entirely distinct identities. She had gradually developed an integrated self-concept, incorporating valuable elements from each phase while transcending limitations inherent to either in isolation. A measured knock at the kitchen door interrupted their conversation, the specific rhythm identifying Hawkins rather than external threat. Sullivan maintained a covering position while Martha opened the reinforced entrance with appropriate caution. Despite the recognition signal, your proposition has merit given developing circumstances, Hawkins stated without preamble as he entered, his expression suggesting pragmatic calculation rather than emotional decision. Carson's operational approach creates an unacceptable risk profile compared to your evacuation proposal. This direct articulation, addressing practical assessment without unnecessary elaboration, reflected Hawkins' professional orientation despite his earlier adversarial position regarding Eleanor and Shadow Creek. Throughout her extraordinary career, Eleanor had recognized that competent opponents often made valuable allies when circumstances created alignment between otherwise divergent interests. Arrangement parameters remain as discussed, Eleanor confirmed, maintaining clear communication despite the accelerated time frame. Cooperative implementation of coordinated withdrawal followed by separate departure vectors once reaching the Northern Trail junction. Hawkins nodded acceptance, his expression suggesting professional appreciation for straightforward negotiation despite complicated circumstances. My men understand operational requirements and compensation structure, he confirmed. Temporary. Alliance serves mutual interest without implying extended commitment beyond immediate tactical situation. This clarity, establishing explicit parameters without unnecessary elaboration, reflected the professional understanding developed between respective tactical operators despite their original adversarial positioning. Throughout her extraordinary career, Eleanor had recognized that competent professionals often maintained communication efficiency regardless of personal feelings or situational complexity. As final preparations reached completion, Eleanor performed a brief inspection, ensuring essential elements received appropriate attention despite pressure circumstances. Throughout her remarkable career, she had maintained this disciplined approach regardless of situation urgency, thorough verification rather than assumption, particularly regarding mission-critical components during high-consequence operations. Evacuation. Timing requires precise coordination to maximize effectiveness, she explained as they gathered for the final briefing before implementation. Sullivan leads the initial team through Western Tunnel, establishing perimeter security at the emergency point. Martha follows with Joseph and secondary resources, maintaining an established interval. Sarah, Hawkins, and I provide covering fire from multiple positions, creating the impression of continued full defensive deployment before executing phased withdrawal through separate routes converging at tunnel entrance. This comprehensive briefing, detailing specific responsibilities without unnecessary elaboration, reflected Eleanor's consistent leadership approach throughout her extraordinary career. Clear direction, provided without micromanagement, establishing framework while allowing appropriate tactical autonomy for experienced team members within established parameters. Questions, she concluded, creating space for legitimate clarification, without encouraging excessive elaboration given time constraints. When no issues required to be addressed, Eleanor nodded approval to Sullivan, who moved toward the concealed entrance to the western tunnel, their primary evacuation route away from the increasingly coordinated approach of Carson and Reeves. Combined forces. As the operation transitioned from preparation to execution, Eleanor cast one final glance around the home she had built and maintained for over 26 years. The simple furnishings and practical arrangements reflected life she had constructed as Eleanor West. Peaceful, productive, connected to community through genuine contribution rather than merely effective deception. Yet within these same walls existed the strategic planning and tactical preparation that characterized Nightshade Nora's legendary methodology. Contingency routes, concealed resources, defensive enhancements invisible to casual observation but critical during crisis circumstances like those currently unfolding. What Carson failed to understand, despite his 16-year vendetta, was that neither identity existed in isolation any longer. The remarkable woman implementing this evacuation operation incorporated elements from both phases of her extraordinary lifetime. Eleanor West's patience and community connection integrated with Nightshade, Nora's tactical brilliance and decisive leadership. As gunfire intensified around the farmhouse perimeter, Eleanor moved toward her position with the balanced grace that reflected this integration. Neither the stooped posture of elderly widow nor the flamboyant confidence of a notorious outlaw, but something more authentic than either performance. In isolation, the Shadow Creek chapter might conclude through this forced evacuation, but the remarkable journey bridging Nightshade Nora and Eleanor West would continue through new circumstances, adapting as she had consistently demonstrated throughout her extraordinary lifetime, while maintaining core principles that transcended a specific identity or context. And perhaps most significantly, this journey would now include Sarah, the young woman whose own remarkable transformation from desperate abuse victim to capable tactical operator paralleled Eleanor's earlier evolution through different circumstances. The legacy extends beyond physical resources or historical reputation to knowledge, transfer, and capability development that would transcend Eleanor's individual lifetime. As they moved into the implementation phase of their evacuation operation, the orchestrated withdrawal from Shadow Creek represented not defeat, but strategic adaptation. Another remarkable chapter in an extraordinary lifetime, characterized by resilience, tactical brilliance, and the consistent capacity to transform circumstances that might defeat less remarkable individuals into opportunities for continued evolution. The legendary Nightshade Nora and the respected Eleanor West, integrated rather than separated, embarked upon this next remarkable chapter with the same qualities that had defined her extraordinary journey from its beginning: meticulous preparation, tactical brilliance, ethical consistency, and the unwavering determination that had made her legend during one lifetime and might yet create entirely new legacy through whatever remarkable circumstances awaited beyond Shadow Creek Valley. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.